Hello, everybody. Welcome to another of Heart UK's webinars. The topic today is going to be genetics and cholesterol. This is, I think, the most number of people that have ever signed up for one of our webinars. So thank you very much. It's lovely to see you all on here. If I could just introduce panelists, if I just double check that Alison. Yeah. Alison's here. Hello.
Hello.
We're joined by Alison Pottle, who is a nurse consultant. If you'd like to give a quick introduction, Alison.
Hi, yes, so I'm Alison Pottle. I'm nurse consultant nurse at Harefield, and part of my role is I'm the clinical lead for the Lipoprotein apheresis unit, and I also work with our FH team at Harefield.
We'll hear the word FH quite a lot today. I'm sure a lot of you know about the condition, but if you don't, then we're going to educate you. Tina Dawson is our lipid specialist nurse. Tina, if you could give a quick intro as well.
Hi there, I'm Tina Dawson, lipid specialist nurse here at Heart UK, and I do the helpline at Heart UK as well as help with all the information that we provide.
I was going to say the helpline and so very much more. So thank you, Tina. So I'd like to just quickly launch a poll. I just want to double check your level of knowledge before we start the webinar about genetics and about cholesterol. Obviously, it's one of those areas that you hear about a lot in the media, but actually a lot of people don't understand the complexities of genetics and how it all works. So hopefully we can help you all with that today. We've actually got quite a lot of people not sure and not particularly knowledgeable, so it's an interesting starting point. We've put together some really strong, frequently asked questions for you guys today. A lot of people voting, thank you very much. And I'll close the poll in a couple of seconds. So yeah, we've got 40% of you not sure, and 30% of you not knowledgeable, 10% not knowledgeable at all. So Tina and Alison, this is your starting point. Got a lot of people not too sure about these things, so let's dive in and start to address some of the questions we've had come through. So if we start with Tina, I think considering people's level of knowledge, I think it's important to start off with a sort of a brief introduction about what exactly we mean when we say genetics.
Thanks, Chris. Well, the Human Genome Project identified between 20,000 and 25,000 different genes which provide a code or set of instructions that we need for our development, and they determine all of our characteristics, such as our hair colour, eye colour, etc. So genes are basic units of heredity, and they're contained in the nucleus of all our cells. They're made up of DNA, and they're packed into structures known as chromosomes. So each of our cells has 23 pairs of chromosomes, and 22 are the same in men and women. The 23rd pair defines our sex, whether we're male or female. So every person has 2 copies of each gene. One's inherited from each parent. So most genes are the same in all people, but a small number, which is about less than 1%, are slightly different in their DNA sequence. And these small differences sort of contribute to our uniqueness and our physical features. So we're all different, basically. So just a small change or alteration in one of the DNA sequences within a specific gene can result in a medical condition or medical problem. So we know that there are genetic cholesterol and triglyceride conditions due to such changes in genes. So some we know can cause low levels of cholesterol. These are very rare conditions, but today I think we're going to focus more on the more common inherited high cholesterol conditions.
I think it's interesting to note that we have so many genes, and just one tiny mistake or alteration can change things and cause all kinds of different genetic conditions. Some people have heard of, some people haven't. But what we do know is that more and more people than ever are curious about, you know, is this inherited? Is this developed because of my lifestyle? What's the divide? Because people have become very, very engaged with their healthcare, especially over the past few years with all the tests that are available. So when it comes to figuring out if in fact a condition such as high cholesterol, is caused by our genes, there are other important steps we have to take too, and Tina's going to talk us through some of those.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, before investigating whether a high cholesterol is due to a genetic condition, healthcare professionals should look into the many other influences on cholesterol, as this can sometimes be the cause, so it's worth ruling these ones out first. This ranges from effects of either an unhealthy diet and lifestyle, so diets high in saturated fats, added sugars, alcohol, for example. This also includes certain medical conditions, so something like an underactive thyroid that hasn't been diagnosed, liver or kidney conditions, the menopause in women, and also the effect of some medications such as steroids and antidepressants. These can all potentially cause changes in our cholesterol and triglyceride levels. So usually they should be ruled out first, and then if our levels are still raised after these have been investigated, then the next step would be to consider something like an inherited genetic condition.
So usually refer to all these things as secondary causes. So it's things that may be going on in the body, whether it's something that you're aware of or not, that could be causing changes in levels. Later on, we're going to talk a little bit more about the process that we go through to see how likely or unlikely it is that a condition is inherited. But it's important to know that whether it's inherited or not, lifestyle will play a big role in your treatment either way. So important to bear that in mind. So of all the conditions, if it is inherited, that it could be, the most common one that we tend to find is a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, or FH, which we mentioned about before. Alison, could you tell us a little bit more about FH itself?
Yeah, definitely. So FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, as you've said, we shorten it because it's such a long word to say all the time. So it is probably the most common inherited cholesterol genetic condition that there is. The incidence seems to be increasing. Whether that's just because we're testing people more than we were before, it's a bit difficult to say, but some of the older books will say that around about 1 in 500 people, it's now thought to be about 1 in 250 people within the population are likely to have this condition. But the vast majority, something like 85%, are not yet identified. The incidence does vary in different parts of the world, so you do hear of certain areas where the incidence is much higher than this, but this is a sort of average figure that is felt to be pretty accurate at the moment. The problem with FH is that it can lead to people having extremely high cholesterol levels, and so if somebody has got a very high level, and we tend to look fairly arbitrarily at around about a total cholesterol of anything over about 7.5, being something that we would be worried about, or if the cholesterol result has got the differentials of cholesterol, so the bad cholesterol, as it tends to be called, the low density lipoprotein, or LDL, if that's above about 4.9, again, we would be concerned. Doesn't always mean that it's going to be genetic, but those are the sorts of levels where it increases the risk, so we would be more concerned then. What FH is what's termed an autosomal dominant inherited condition, and that basically means that if somebody has FH, then there is a 50% chance of it being passed on every time a child is conceived. So there's a 1 in 2 chance. It's a little bit like flipping a coin. So it doesn't mean everyone will get it. You could have a family of 10 children if you wanted to have 10 children, and have none of them infected with the condition, or you could have everybody affected. So it is literally a 50-50 chance every time a child's conceived.
Yeah, as we said before, it's quite interesting to see the effects that just a small change that happens with FH can have on our bodies. So we've had quite a lot of questions coming from people who joined us today about the actual genetics behind FH. So Alison's going to talk to us a little bit more around the genetics themselves, whereas we've just talked about the effects that those can have.
Okay, so in FH, there's usually a change or an alteration in the known genes which give instructions to make proteins. involved in the removal of LDL, the bad cholesterol, and this is done by LDL receptors. So the LDL receptors are generally on the outside of the liver, but they're on various other cells as well, but we tend to look mostly at the liver ones. And what they try and do is they pick up the cholesterol-rich LDL particles from the bloodstream and take them into the cell, where basically that's then dealt with so that we either store the cholesterol within the cell, or it can be removed, and that's removed as something called bile. And then what should happen is that the receptor will sort of what's called recycle. So it comes from inside the cell, goes back onto the surface of the cell so that it can do its job again and pick up more LDL particles. So there's this sort of circular movement of the receptors picking up the LDL and then packaging it, hopefully getting rid of any excess that we need, and then going back to the surface of the liver to do that all again. When people have inherited an altered gene, then there's a problem with this system, and the cholesterol levels therefore increase. So in FH, people tend to have less of the receptors, and that means that the receptors that there are doing a harder job. They can't get rid of the LDL cholesterol, and therefore the level in the bloodstream is raised. So the most common situation with FH is that it's actually the receptor gene, the LDL receptor gene, that has an alteration in it. And that's usually in anything around about 90% of cases of people who have FH. And there are lots and lots of different alterations of the gene that have been discovered, and these are being discovered all the time. So over 1,500 have been discovered so far. There are also a couple of sort of less common genes that can also have an effect and called FH. So one is called the ApoB gene, and ApoB is a protein on the outside of the LDL particle, and when you get a change of that, what happens is it can't bind to the LDL receptor. So the LDL receptor is trying to bind to it and it doesn't work. Therefore, the LDL is not removed from the blood. And this tends to, in most people, cause a milder condition than people who have the LDL receptor gene problem. And then also there's something called PCSK9. This is a gene that relates to a protein, and the protein is in the cell, and what it will do is it will destroy the receptor. So when the receptor goes into the cell, it gets destroyed, and it therefore can't recycle back onto the surface of the cell to pick up more LDL. And again, this is fairly rare. We don't see this in very many people. And then other genes are being found all the time. So there is an ApoE gene. Numerous different ones are being discovered that can cause FH in various different people. So if we see a patient who has got a high cholesterol level, so we've talked about total cholesterols being above approximately 7.5, or the LDL cholesterol over about 4.9, then we are worried that there may well be an inherited problem with the patient. So we then look at the family history. We find out if anyone else in the family is known to have high cholesterol, and whether the individual themselves has had any heart problems, particularly if they've happened early, and we tend to talk about anything happening before the age of 60 as being early. One of the problems with FH is that the person will have been exposed to high levels of cholesterol for all of their life, because if it's a condition that is inherited, you have it from birth. So it may not be picked up until somebody's quite a bit older, but they have had that exposure all the time. And the problem therefore is that if people don't get diagnosed until later on, so particularly if we talk about men not diagnosed before the age of 50 or women not diagnosed before the age of 60, then there's about a 50% chance of them already having a heart problem that may not have been diagnosed either. Obviously, therefore, picking up the problem as early as we can and getting patients on correct treatment will then reduce that risk so that hopefully we won't have the 50% of people having an undiagnosed problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having a test as early as possible, being aware of your family history. So one of the things that we don't talk about very much with our families often is illness and conditions and things like that. It's not a very pleasant topic, but actually understanding your history can be really helpful for conditions like this. So from what Alison said, you can see that testing for FH is vital, as young as we possibly can do it. So Tina is actually going to talk to us about the testing process itself.
Yeah, so if FH is suspected, then our national guidelines currently recommend referral to a specialist, so usually a lipid clinic, for an assessment where they confirm the diagnosis with a genetic test, and then for the testing of other family members. Now that's known as cascade testing. The lipid clinic usually carries out an assessment using protocols such as something called the Dutch score or the Simon-Broom criteria, just to get a better understanding as to whether someone may have FH and whether they meet the criteria to have a genetic test, which is the gold standard to identify FH. This will take into account their cholesterol levels, their family or personal history of heart disease or high cholesterol, presence of any outward signs of high cholesterol, such as tendon xanthomas. Now they're lumps of cholesterol that you can see in some people on their knuckles and on their heels. So the first person that's identified with possible FH and genetically tested in the family is usually referred to as the index case or proband. So this genetic test looks for all the known FH causing genes in the particular area that they are. So because they are the first person to present, then the process to find the gene can take a long time, because if you remember, we've got thousands and thousands of genes, and they're just going to try and look for a FH causing gene in amongst all of that, so it can take time. So once a specific gene is identified, this will give the person a confirmed diagnosis of FH. And then all close family members should be tested for the same gene, which is the cascade testing. This test takes much less time because scientists now know which gene they are looking for, and they will look for the same gene in the other family members. So it's important to be aware that FH doesn't skip a generation. So what we said before, we know that there's a 1 in 2 or a 50% chance of inheriting it in a family. Sometimes not everyone who inherits the gene will have that high level of cholesterol. We call that the high level of cholesterol, commonly they call it the phenotype. And some of our specialists say that this is because some people will also inherit genes which actually lower their LDL cholesterol. So as well as having the FH causing gene, so it kind of cancels it out. So, and if these particular people are following a healthy diet and lifestyle, it means that they're less likely to display this phenotype or high level of cholesterol. So therefore, if we only rely on cholesterol results, it can be misleading. So the reason the focus is on genetic testing is that currently the people who carry the FH gene may then pass on to their children, and they may not inherit the same LDL lowering gene.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, we have all these different terminologies, but the basic principles are actually quite simple. So your genotype, just to summarize, is the genetic mutation that you inherit, whether that's the LDL receptor gene issue, whether it's ApoB, as Alison said before, and your phenotype is how it behaves, how it affects your body. So you can inherit obviously all sorts of different genes from your parents. Some of them may cause generally lower cholesterol levels because they have great advantageous properties, but there's no guarantee that when you get them, that you will hand them down to your children. So equally with FH, we need to do cholesterol levels, but we also need to do genetic testing to determine what exactly is going on in the body. So when we do the genetic test, we're going to talk a little bit more about that process. It's quite straightforward, but Alison has done a lot of work around this.
So the first thing we would do with the index patient, the proband, as Tina has said, is do a blood test. then that blood test, as she's explained, will be looking for a variety of different genes, because we don't know whether the person has FH, and if they do have FH, what exact genetic problem they have. Once that's been established, then as Tina's explained, then the rest of the family would be cascade tested, and that cascade testing can be done with a blood test, but is more frequently now done with mouth swabs or saliva tests. That's obviously a much kinder way of doing things, particularly for children, because the other problem being, of course, if you have to have a blood test, you've got to come to a hospital or a doctor's surgery to have that done, whereas swabs can be done in the home. Obviously, there's a little bit of a problem at the moment, because with COVID, we're not able to be doing as many mouth swabs and saliva tests as we were doing previously, but we try and do those as much as possible with relatives. People don't need to have their lipids done if they're being cascade tested. It's the genetic test that's the most important thing. So, and as has been explained earlier, relatives could have very low levels and still have a genetic problem. So it's important that the cascade testing is done for everybody in the family.
Absolutely. And then if we find somebody, we need to treat them. So if somebody's had a positive test, Tina, what can they expect from the actual treatment process?
Well, for everybody, a healthy diet and lifestyle is important. Well, a medication is usually needed because of all the reasons that we've explained: high cholesterol and the length of time people may have been exposed to this high cholesterol, i.e. since birth. The first line of treatment is usually with a statin, usually at a higher dose. The aim is to reduce that LDL cholesterol by at least 50% or more. This is because at this reduction, all the research has shown any plaques in the arteries stop their progression, and then we start to see some regression or the shrinking back of plaques, if there are any. Other medications that we can use are, the second line treatment is known as ezetimibe, and then we have newer medications called the PCSK9 inhibitors, which work on the PCSK9 protein that was mentioned earlier, another form of FH, and they actually stop it destroying the LDL receptor. So that's an injectable treatment.
Yeah, I think people have heard a lot of that in the news recently. Actually, there's been a lot of media attention around injectables for cholesterol. So PCSK9 are indeed an injection. We follow quite strict criteria at the moment as to who's able to get those or not. But obviously anybody with FH should talk to their specialist about whether those drugs are suitable for them. We've had quite a lot of people, Tina, and I know that in our next section, we are talking about children. So we're usually quite likely to find adults with FH and raised cholesterol. This is usually actually because they've had a routine check. So whether people go to their GP for an NHS health check at the age of 40, or whether they're having general bloods done for workup, maybe for surgery or similar. So what is the guidance that sits around if a child may be affected by FH?
Well, children of a parent who have a definite genetic diagnosis of FH should be tested for the gene at least by the age of 10. The earlier the condition is identified, the better. So we know that because children with FH have roughly twice the normal LDL cholesterol level from birth, they can develop atherosclerosis that is detectable compared with their unaffected brothers or sisters by the age of between 8 to 10 years. Children will be under the care of a specialist in pediatrics and lipids, and they will advise when they would need to start any kind of treatment like medication. For the younger children, it normally means healthy diet and lifestyle advice, dietitians. Current guidelines recommend considering medication for children at least between the ages of 8 to 10. But again, they will be under a specialist. The importance of genetic testing is, particularly for children, is when they reach puberty, they encounter what we call the growth spurt. And during that time they can use up cholesterol during this growing phase, because our cholesterol makes our cell membranes, produces hormones, etc. And so therefore children's cholesterol levels may be lower and they're unreliable at that time, which is why it is recommended that we do a genetic test and not rely specifically on the cholesterol results. When we look at the family screening, if a family member's test is negative, i.e. they can't find the gene and their cholesterol level is normal, then this is good news, and it would mean that they have not inherited the condition. So in turn, they will not pass it on to their children. Their risk, however, should be assessed the same as we would in the general population for heart disease and stroke.
So as you can see, we have a little bit of feedback there. Let me just sort that out. So as you can see, we know quite a lot about FH. A lot of research has been done around it, and it's a condition that we as a specialist lipid charity talk about quite a lot. But as with most things, some cases can be a lot more complicated than just a straightforward mutation we can find through testing. So sometimes we will find abnormalities in genes, but we don't always know what that means for the person, because genetics is so complicated. And like Tina said before, you can inherit different things from different parents, which can actually impact on the mutation itself. So Alison is going to talk to us a little bit more about these.
So yes, sometimes a test for FH comes back with a result that says that there's a variant with unknown significance. So it means that something perhaps doesn't quite look right in either the LDL gene or the ApoB or PCSK9, but it's unknown whether the change is actually a harmless change or whether it's something that could be causing FH. As we said earlier, the number of genes that have been recognised that cause FH is increasing all the time. So we may find something and not know at this point whether it is causing a problem or not. And under those circumstances, specialists may want to test other family members before actually deciding whether this could be an FH gene or not. The overall message with all of this is that it's, regardless of whether somebody has got FH or not, is it's really important to treat the cholesterol level, because it's the high cholesterol level that causes the risk. So if the level is raised, then patients should still be treated, even if they haven't got a genetic diagnosis of FH. If a gene is not found in somebody with high cholesterol, then it's also important to understand what that means. It means that as far as we know, you don't have FH, but it might be, again, that it's a gene that hasn't been identified yet. So we tend to say that it's an unconfirmed situation, but as time goes on and we find more genes, then we may find that something that was unconfirmed a few years ago is now said to be one of the FH genes.
So if we're saying that sometimes it's not FH, there are potentially a whole host of genes, rather than just one, that can contribute towards high cholesterol. So Tina, could you talk to us a little bit more about those? Oh, quite a bit of feedback.
Yeah, I mean, if a single FH causing gene isn't found, then what the specialists can now do is they carry out next generation sequencing, and they look for what's called polygenic hypercholesterolemia. Now, polygenic just means there are many different genes involved, and cholesterol is raised because of the effects of these genes added together. So basically, each of the polygenes on its own can raise cholesterol by a small amount, but if you inherit quite a few of them, then your cholesterol level can be high. I think 12 or so have been identified, and they can be screened for in the laboratories. Although the polygenic form is thought not to be as severe as the FH single gene, people are still at risk of developing heart disease because of this high level of cholesterol. And so they should also be offered, cholesterol lowering medications such as statins. to help reduce their risk, and also making sure all their other risk factors are well controlled is really important. Currently, the cascade testing that's offered for families in FH is not offered for those with a polygenic form yet, as it's thought not to be cost effective. Now, people can have both the single FH causing gene, and they can also have a background of these polygenes, which can explain why levels of cholesterol can vary in family members. We've got an example of two sisters we heard about, one who had both had the FH causing gene. One had a total cholesterol of about 8.5 with a known FH causing gene, and the other sister had a cholesterol around about 15, much higher. And she was found to have the same FH causing gene, but she also had a high background of these polygenes. So in most families, it may not be such a marked difference, but it can explain why their levels can differ. And also, as we mentioned earlier, you can also inherit these LDL lowering genes. Now, I think for those who have the next generation sequencing, and they find they have a low polygenic score, it's known as an SNP score, it can mean that they may have a single FH causing gene, which just has not yet been identified. As Alison says, we're identifying genes all the time. So this may indicate that. This was being addressed by the 100,000 Genome Project, which looks for new genes.
Oh, I was muted. 100,000 Genome Project, incredibly interesting project. If anyone wants to do a little bit more reading about that, it's absolutely fascinating. And we plug a lot of very interesting results into this database. So basically what we can do over time is, if we can see patterns in these variants we find when we're not always sure what they do or how they behave, the more people we find and the more information we have from genetic testing, the more likely we are in future to figure out what these genetic mutations actually do. Another thing that we wanted to cover today, we've had quite a few questions about, is all about lipoprotein A. Sometimes it's referred to as LPA. And Alison's going to give us a rundown about LPA.
Okay, so there are lots and lots of different lipoproteins, and lipoprotein, little a as it's sometimes called, is a genetically determined lipoprotein. So it's very similar to LDL. It's actually made up of an LDL particle, but it also has attached to it another protein molecule, which is called apolipoprotein A. Over the last probably about 30 or 40 years, it has been identified as an independent risk factor for people developing heart disease. So there is a causal link between flaring up of arteries, people having heart attacks, having some disease of the heart valves, and also having strokes in those people who have high levels of Lp(a). So as well as having a high LDL, you can have a high level of Lp(a), but the two things don't have to both be raised or both be normal. You can have sort of weird variations of the two levels. So it's really a bit unknown as to how many people with FH actually do have high levels of Lp(a), and it depends which bits of the literature you read as to whether it's a large proportion of FH sufferers or only a small number. But in some people, it is thought that the reason for heart attacks or strokes, particularly in much younger people, is because they have high levels of Lp(a), because they may not have any other of the sort of well-known risk factors for developing these conditions. Lp(a) is not something that is measured routinely in every GP practice. So if you have your cholesterol level done, it's only really going to be measured if you have it done in a specialist centre, which is unfortunate, because we could really do with getting as many people as possible to have their Lp(a) measured. The best treatment at the moment is a combination of reducing the LDL level, so all of the things that Tina's already said, getting your LDL down as low as possible, because Lp(a) is partly an LDL particle, and that will help to a degree to reduce the level of Lp(a). Unfortunately, there are no specific treatments for it from a medication point of view. The only thing that will actually work by reduce the Lp(a) is something called lipoprotein apheresis, which is a dialysis type treatment that actually removes the blood from the body, filters it, and it's able to filter out the Lp(a) levels. There's a lot of work going on at the moment to develop medication that would actually help lower Lp(a), because obviously apheresis is quite an invasive treatment and is not available in a lot of places in the UK. So there's a new injectable treatment being researched currently, which is called an antisense therapy. That's still in clinical trials at the moment. The results so far are very positive, and it appears to reduce the levels by anything up to around about 90%. But as I say, still in clinical trial process at the moment. Some of the other medications can actually have an effect on Lp(a). So the PCSK9 injectable drugs can, but it's only really a very mild reduction that they will give, anything up to about 25%. So for the moment, in order to get a significant reduction in Lp(a), it's really only lipoprotein apheresis that can be used. There's still a certain amount of uncertainty about whether lowering Lp(a) does actually reduce people's cardiovascular risk. So we know that reducing LDL reduces the cardiovascular risk, but again, there's trials going on at the moment to hopefully prove whether we need to specifically be looking at lowering the Lp(a) in addition to lowering the LDL.
So Lp(a), very popular topic. We've had about 5 or 6 questions come in just as you've been talking, Alison. So it's very interesting to see what people are interested in. What we'll do before we start to address some of your questions, I've tried to answer some of the questions on the Q&A, but they're coming through thick and fast, guys, so I'll do my best. I just want to launch the poll again, and hopefully, after all the great information that Tina and Alison have provided, you guys are a lot more knowledgeable. This is incredibly important for us to understand if our webinars help with your level of knowledge and your ability to talk about these things. One of the key aims of the charity is obviously to raise awareness of conditions and increase people's knowledge of them. So it's great for us to know how you've been affected by our webinars. A huge number of people now compared to before are saying they're knowledgeable. There is no quiz, so don't worry about saying you're very knowledgeable if you feel quite confident. But we've got over 75% of people saying that they're knowledgeable, and we've got a very confident 13% of people who say they're very knowledgeable. So that's fantastic, guys. I'll end the poll there. I'm going to start to move over some questions. So Alison, you just talked about Lp(a), and we've had a few questions come through about that already. Most of the questions that are coming through seem to be what is a healthy level, and at what age you would have Lp(a) tested for.
Okay, so the healthy level depends on the way that it is measured. There are various different what we call assays, different ways of actually measuring the Lp(a). Probably still in the UK, the most common one would be saying that a level of less than 300 milligrams per litre would be the ideal. So 300 and above is thought to be is elevated. So under 300 we would say would be a healthy level. The recommendation is that everybody ideally should have their Lp(a) tested once in their lifetime, because it's completely genetically determined. There is an argument that it won't change over time. So ideally, at some point when you have a cholesterol test done, to get the Lp(a) tested, particularly important in people who have had heart problems or family members have had heart problems. But there's no specific age that we would say at the moment to get it tested, but just try and get it done once.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic because we do as we do more and more research, it may be that that stance changes. This is the interesting thing about these things, is the more people we can get tested appropriately, the more we will learn about these things and the more treatments that can be created for it. Obviously, as Alison said, apheresis is not ideal, but it's vital in some people to help prevent them from having heart attacks and strokes. I should say further heart attacks and strokes. These people are generally very, very high risk of a further event. We've had quite a few questions through about genetic testing, in that, is it available across the UK? Yes, it is. Some people do experience barriers to referrals. A lot of the time it's due to a lack of education in some healthcare professionals, whereby they're not sure when to refer. There is very, very clear guidance in place. You can find it on the Heart UK website. You can also find it on the NICE website, which is the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. They have very clear guidance in place which tells you when you need to refer and think about FH. And there are various bits of criteria like Simon Broom that we mentioned before, and the Dutch lipid scores. If you do have a very high cholesterol, and especially if you have a strong family history, it's worth a proper conversation with your GP. Have a look at some of the literature online to see if you seem to fit the criteria, and you can also search your nearest lipid clinic. A lipid clinic is the best place for many people to be that have very high cholesterol, especially if we think it may be genetic. There are lots of weird and wonderful conditions as well as FH2, so just because you don't fit one profile, it doesn't mean it's not a genetic problem. So always, always ask. I'm having a little look through the questions now. Any dietary questions? I'm afraid that Alison, Tina and I are all nurses, so dietary questions probably not our forte. You can email ask, that's ask@heartuk.org.uk for any dietary questions. Quite a few coming through about PCSK9. So with PCSK9 injections, Alison, do you want to give a little bit more information about their effectiveness and potential side effects if possible?
The evidence is that PCSK9 injections are very effective, but again, as with any medication, it varies from person to person. So in the same way as statins will work very well with some members of the population and not with others, the same thing happens with PCSK9 injections. But there is evidence that you can get, up to a 70% reduction in LDL levels using the injectable drugs. They are generally very well tolerated, but again, as with every medication, they do have some side effects. But the most common one probably is a little bit of soreness around the injection site, but generally they are well tolerated. But if people have got questions about that, the best thing to do is to talk to their lipid clinic, to their lipid specialist about whether they might be eligible for the drugs, and then they'd have a better discussion about the individual drugs available, the side effects, and the potential benefits that are felt to be for them as an individual.
So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Tina. Bye, guys.
Thank you.